Story 10 of Stories Weird and Wonderful. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Peter Yearsley. Stories Weird and Wonderful by J. E. Muddock. Story 10. The China Dog. A physical problem. Men say I am mad. Men think I am so, else why do they fasten me here? Why entomb me in this dismal charnel house? Why condemn me to suffer a living death? I listen to the songs of birds as they chant their melodies in the trees outside. I can hear the sighing of the wind. I can see the moon and the sun and the stars. But all these things are not for me. I am dead, yet live. Men have pointed at me and called me weird, gloomy, mysterious. But I have not always been so. Time was when I could laugh as others laugh, when the smell of flowers, the songs of birds, and the music of rippling waters gladdened my heart, when sleep was not a curse, life a mockery. Would you like to hear my story? Listen patiently, and I will tell it to you. It may be that the narrative will be a little incoherent and wild, for I find it difficult to string my thoughts together. But what of that? I know that I shall awaken some responsive memory in your breast. Let me begin. I go into the dim, mysterious past. Time, the gloaming of a fitful day in chill October. The scene, a wood, solemn and deep. The lingering light falls through the overarching boughs and weaves fantastic shadows on the green sward. There is a strain of melody, low but sweet. 'Tis the evening hymn of the birds, the same grand symphony that rose from Eden ages ago. I linger amid the shadows. I drink in the rich, pure air. I am reckless of the future. I live only in the present. I am happy even in my solitude. The dying sun sinks lower. His shafts of red smite the clouds, until trees and sward glow in living crimson light. Then, gradually, the leaves turn to bronze as the rose light fades. The sun goes down in a bank of clouds, and an ashen hue is over all things. The bird melody ceases. A silence that is not a silence reigns through the leafy aisles. Still my heart is light. Not a care rests there at this moment. I am free. I am young. Life lies before me. The world is beautiful. As I stand with the hush of the October night around me, I am startled by the appearance of a woman. Woman was the blight on paradise. Why did this woman come to me? She is young in years. Her face is attractive and yet very far from beautiful. Meeting as we did in that quiet, lonely wood, what wonder that I should address her, or that she should politely accept my offer to be her escort homeward. We chatted freely upon such subjects as thoughtful men and women love. We stepped out of the cold, conventional region of formality and talked as if we had been old acquaintances. I found her mind well stored with useful knowledge, but it was not the knowledge derived from travel, nor experience gained of men and manners in various parts of the world. The result was, as it invariably is with such people, that she was a confirmed bigot, with curiously distorted notions of the world she lived in. Arguments were unavailing to change any opinion she had once formed, and though an opponent might talk her into silence, no amount of logic could convince her. She was melancholy and morbid in disposition, and for a woman of her years, strangely lethargic. Her nature was cold and hard, and she was totally wanting in that nerve energy which gives mental warmth and life to man or woman. We loitered on our way, and when I left her, darkness had closed in. As I took my way towards my home, heavy drops of rain began to fall, which were quickly followed by startling peals of thunder and brilliant electrical coruscations. Being some distance from any house, I was forced to take shelter beneath the trees. At that time, the woman I had just left was nothing more to me than any other person with whom I might have enjoyed a chance and brief acquaintance. She certainly did not belong to the type of those who enslave men at first sight. We had met and parted, but though I tried to dismiss her from my mind, I could not succeed. I saw her face every time the lightning caused the trees to appear in shadowy outline. If I turned from the spot where I had last seen it, I saw it where I was then looking. It haunted me, and though I shut my eyes, I could not shut out her face. I found myself unconsciously associating her dry, harsh voice with the metallic sound of the falling rain as it beat upon the leaves, and the chill wind that blew into my face I likened to her nature. Perhaps my lonely situation, being in the midst of a wood during the thunderstorm, had a depressing effect. At any rate, I know that a strange melancholy fastened upon me, and I wished that I had never met that woman. In spite of the strongest mental effort, I could not shake off a growing conviction that she would in some way influence my future destiny. I was young, ambitious, enthusiastic, with strong mental and physical energy, which I did not doubt would enable me ultimately to take a fair position amongst my fellow men. I had had many sorrows in my early life, but there had come a year or two of sunshine that had almost dissipated the shadows of the past. But this woman had brought back the blackness again. Her face conjured up ghosts of dead memories, until the book of my life, which I had prayed might never more be opened, appeared to my mental vision, and I read the record that I thought had been blotted out with tears of youthful follies, of disappointed hopes, of lost opportunities, and above all, of a dead love. When I turned from the volume of bitterness towards what future might be mine, I saw the steep of fame which I hoped to climb, but between it and me stood the form of the woman I had met that night, and with a cruel light in her eyes she barred my progress upward. The storm gradually died away. One by one the stars came out, cold and glittering. The wind had faded to a fitful sigh, and the only sounds I heard were the occasional twitter of a bird as it started in its sleep, and the melancholy drip, drip, drip of the rain as it drained from the foliage of the trees. As I hurried quickly homeward, I made a mental vow that I would in no way seek to renew the acquaintance of the woman who had exerted such a strange influence over me. But the more I tried to banish her from my thoughts, the stronger grew the conviction she was my fate, my doom, my skeleton. There is a limited class of deep and earnest thinkers who maintain that man is not altogether a free agent, but is subject to influences, good or evil, against which he is powerless to wrestle, that in proportion to the acquirements of knowledge and the broadening of his views, which observations and travel cannot fail to effect, he will gradually reject the dogmas of his youth, and, launching himself on the ocean of speculation, will drift away to darkness or light. But though he may see destruction ahead, he is as powerless to avert it as he would be to stay the sun on its diurnal course. I boldly avow myself a disciple of this teaching. I say that men are slaves to fate, and though we may somewhat pervert a destiny, we cannot avoid it. This may seem a strange phantasm, but the student of psychology will know how much truth it contains. But why should I dwell on this? Better to hurry to the sequel of my story. 12 months passed, during which I saw nothing of the woman who had so strangely influenced me on the night of the storm, and, excepting in a very vague way, I had almost ceased to think of her. Then we met again. I had been invited to spend the evening with a party of friends on some festive occasion, and on my arrival I was surprised to find that she was a guest. Our host was about to introduce us, when I saved him the trouble by crossing the room and taking her hand, which she proffered freely. "Miss Nora and I have met before," I observed, and then, noticing the look of astonishment on my host's face, I added quickly, "Oh, we were casual acquaintances a year ago now." It was strange that the light of her eyes and the touch of her hand produced the same agitation from which I had suffered on the occasion of our former meeting. After our first greetings, I tried during the remainder of the evening to avoid her, but she fascinated me, enthralled me, bound my soul in fetters that I could not break. Once more I became her escort home, and that night, when I left her, I was her slave. Did I love her? Does the slave love its master? Does the caged tiger that is taught to perform before a gaping crowd love its keeper? Does the bird love the serpent that fascinates it? 3 months passed, and we met again. It was in the winter time, and the ice-bound earth was typical of her own frozen nature. Our meeting was totally unexpected. We were both invited to a skating party. The surprise of each was unfeigned on meeting the other. Again I tried to avoid her. Again I was powerless. I do not think she sought me. I am certain I did not seek her, and yet we constantly came together. When we were parting that night, I pressed my lips to hers for the first time. She returned my kiss, but hers was cold, passionless. It was the kiss of a statue, whose lips moved by some ingenious mechanism, but the emotional warmth of a loving woman was not there. We met frequently after this. I felt that the die was cast, and I must abide by the hazard of it. I soon discovered that her theological views were painfully narrowed, and she affected a stoicism that was unwomanly. I saw all this. I tried to break off the connection, but my efforts to free myself resulted in my becoming more securely entangled in the web into which I had fluttered. A few short months, and she became my wife. I am sure our wedding was unlike other weddings. There were no smiles, no flowers, no bright dresses, no bells, no sunshine. It was a dull, ashen morning, and the church was filled with a cold, damp mist. Why did I select such a day? It was not my choice, it was fate's. From the moment that I left the church portals, the shadows commenced to gather over my path in life. My wife and I went to the continent to spend the honeymoon. To others, this period generally means a few brief weeks of unalloyed pleasure. To me, it was a month of vexation, disappointments, and crosses. In 2 or 3 days' time it seemed that I had been married for years. Our tastes were totally dissimilar. There was no sympathy in common between us. She grew more and more lethargic, more prosaic, narrower-minded. She made no effort to give me pleasure. She discovered and magnified all my faults, but closed her eyes to whatever virtues I might have possessed. I tried so hard, so earnestly to win her heart, her confidence, her woman's trust, but I totally failed. Not that I was without faults, or even thought so. On the contrary, I was keenly alive to the angularities of my character, but there were so many of them that a loving hand might have smoothed away. I asked this woman to do it. She refused, and so the breach widened. We drifted further and further from each other in mind, but the law had chained us, and the bond was inseparable. My dream of future greatness faded. I saw that my hopes of gaining a high social position would never be realized. It was impossible to raise her, and so I was dragged into the depths of moral gloom that she occupied. I grew callous, became indifferent to those things that most men struggle for. How often have I asked how it was that this woman was so blind? Was it a disease? Was she responsible for her actions? I have been all through life a home lover. I had fancied that the domestic circle was a safe shelter from the world's care. How cruelly I was deceived! Was I harsh, cruel, intemperate, indifferent? No. Was I unmindful of her pleasures, her welfare? No. I ask the questions, and I answer them truly before high heaven. Wherein, then, lay the cause of our misery? in a distorted view of life, in a frozen nature that nothing could thaw, not mine, but hers. 2 years passed. My loveless home and close application to work produced their effect, and I became a valetudinarian. Change of scene and air were absolutely necessary. I went abroad, and my wife accompanied me. We continued to travel for a considerable time, but I derived little or no benefit. My skeleton was goading me on to madness or death. Somebody has said that there is an unknown history of our own lives for wise purposes concealed from us in this world, but which it may be our privilege in another existence to learn. Shall we then know in what degree we have been really loved by others or disliked? Moreover, shall we know why others have disliked us? If ever there was a time when I needed the kindly ministration of a gentle hand, the soothing consolation of a loving voice, it was at this period of my travels. They might have saved me then from toppling into the gulf of mental darkness. But neither the hand nor the voice came, and I was lost. My wife grew colder and more indifferent. My existence became a burden. One stage of our journey we had been travelling all day in a diligence, when, towards evening, the axle of the vehicle broke, and we were overturned on the very verge of an awful precipice. This accident had its effect upon nerves strung already to the very highest tension, and though my wife and I received but a few trifling bruises, the mental shock to both was very great. As night had closed in, and it was impossible to obtain another vehicle then, or get our own in such a condition as to enable us to resume our journey, we decided to walk on about 2 miles to the nearest village, which we reached tired, jaded, and in an alarming state of nervous excitement. The place could boast of but one hostelry, and that of the poorest description, but there was no choice, and so we were forced to accept such shelter as the village afforded. There was an air of settled melancholy about the house that was most depressing. A dingy waiter stood in the passage as we entered, but he seemed incapable of moving, having grown into a chronic state of inactivity through waiting so long for somebody to wait upon. An asthmatical old woman showed us to our sleeping apartment. It was a large, square, draughty, ghostly place, and as I crossed the threshold I fairly shuddered, for a great shadow seemed to fall upon me. The paper was peeling off the walls in long rolls, and from the ceiling cobwebs that apparently had been undisturbed for years hung down in festoons. The carpet on the floor was old and faded, the curtains at the windows dusty and time-stained. The feeling engendered on entering this neglected apartment was such as one experiences on crossing the threshold of a tomb that has been shut up for years. The air was heavy with the smell of dampness and decay. There was not one redeeming feature in the place. An old-fashioned clothes-press was gradually going to pieces in one corner. The 4 bare poles of a curtainless bedstead rose in the centre of the room like the spars of a battered ship. A sofa, affected with rick in the joints, and a few consumptive-looking chairs completed the furniture. Thinking that a fire would impart a little comfort to the cheerless place, I called for the chambermaid. She appeared in the person of the asthmatical old woman, who used every effort to kindle some wood in the grate, but without avail, for there was no draught in the chimney, and the smoke came back into the room in clouds, and, after a few fitful splutters, the flame from the wood, for want of oxygen, went out. When the old woman, who in despair abandoned the attempt to produce a fire, had left the room, I threw myself on the sofa, thoroughly heartsick and weary. As I lay there, my eyes wandered to the shelf over the fireplace, and then for the first time I noticed There was a cracked mirror, and in front of this mirror a large china dog. It was a white dog with painted black eyes and a red mouth, from which a portion of the tongue protruded. There was nothing extraordinary about this ornament, excepting that it was unusually large and thickly coated with dust, and yet, as my gaze rested on it, I became visibly affected. This painted bit of china had a strange fascination over me in my morbidly nervous condition. It fretted and irritated me. It alarmed me. How or why I know not. Unable longer to stand the fixed stare of its painted eyes, I rose, and telling my wife that I was faint and would walk about outside the house till she had finished unpacking, I left the room. As I traversed the passage, I noticed the mouldy waiter still standing there. It seemed as if he had not changed his position in the least. His hands were crossed, and his face wore an air of settled melancholy that was heightened by the sickly yellow glare of a lamp suspended by an iron chain from the ceiling. I passed into the road, and the night wind blew refreshingly cool on my heated forehead. On the other side of the roadway was a long row of tall trees, and a low stone wall separated them from a river whose black waters flowed along with a dismal moaning sound. I crossed over and seated myself upon the wall in the shadow of the trees. No living soul passed up or down the roadway as I sat there. Save for the fitful glimmer of the lamp in the hotel passage, there were no indications of human life, and even that I likened to a watch lamp at the portals of a tomb. The horrible moaning of the sullen river and the ghostly creaking of the branches of the trees were the only sounds that broke the otherwise death-like stillness of the place, and even they only served to make the stillness more noticeable. How long I sat there I know not, but it must have been a considerable time, for when I rose I was damp with the dew and chilled to the bone. An unaccountable feeling of depression had taken possession of me. I was melancholy, and there was a burning desire to weep passionate, scalding tears, but this relief was denied me. As I passed into the hotel, I noticed that the waiter had moved at last. He was sitting in a chair that stood in the passage. He was asleep, but it seemed like the sleep of death, for his mouth was open and his eyes were only partly closed. I went upstairs, and on reaching the landing found the place in darkness. Then, for the first time, I became conscious of the fact that I was not alone. There was another presence with me, not a substantial, palpable being, but a faintly luminous, transparent figure of myself. From this figure I looked upon my own body. I saw my own face, oh, so ghastly, so haggard, so pitiful. In my eyes there was such a pleading, such a yearning for love, a wife's tenderness. I groped my way along the gloomy corridor to my chamber. I determined to throw myself at my wife's feet, to implore her to comfort me, to give me sympathy, to save me from myself. I opened the door. The candle had burnt low in the socket, and the room was in partial gloom. The bed was tenantless. My wife had not undressed, but was seated on the sofa, her head buried in her hands. I thought that she was weeping, and my astonishment was great, for she had repeatedly told me she could never weep. I had often been impressed with the idea that if she could but find relief in a flood of tears, her frozen nature would thaw, that her heart would throb with warm, healthful, loving life. As I saw her now in an attitude of seeming grief, I felt that my wishes were realized, and that the moment had arrived when I could prove to her that I could forget myself and find pleasure only in ministering to her comfort. I crossed quickly to where she was seated. I was about to throw my arms around her neck when she raised her head. Would to heaven I could blot out the memory of her face as I saw it then. It was inhuman in its look of withering hate. It was inhuman in its ashen hue. There were no tears there, but the eyes glowed with an unnatural metallic lustre. I recoiled from her in horror. My heart seemed to stand still. "You are a fiend!" she shrieked. "An inhuman monster! You placed that dog there to haunt me. I dare not go near it, and it will not move. Oh, I would to God that I were dead!" She pointed as she spoke to the china dog on the mantelpiece that had attracted my own attention. I saw in an instant that she was suffering from a violent fit of hysterics, no doubt the result of the shock sustained through the carriage accident, and which had been intensified by the ghostly air of this comfortless apartment. Thinking she would be better in a recumbent position, I placed my arms around her waist, with a view of lifting her onto the bed, but she struggled with almost superhuman strength, and dug her nails into my flesh until I fairly writhed with pain. I dragged her over to the fireplace, at the side of which hung a bell rope. I seized this rope, thinking to summon assistance, but the thing was rotten with age and came away in my hand. Nerved by desperation, I struggled for some time with the frenzied woman, whose grip I could not loosen until she became fairly exhausted. Then I managed to take off her travelling dress, lay her upon the bed, and bathe her temples with water. She gradually grew calmer, and in a little while sank into a fitful slumber. I was now fairly worn out. The excitement had kept me up for a little while, but that having passed, all my strength seemed to leave with it, and with difficulty I managed to get off my coat and throw myself upon the bed. At this moment the candle expired with a gasp, but as it did so, a strange, weird, unearthly light pervaded the apartment. It was a sort of luminous mist through which I could discern the things in ghostly outline. Whether this was a fearful reality or merely imagination owing to a disordered state of the brain, I leave others to judge. I have my own idea. I know what I believe. Presently this light grew stronger. It seemed to radiate from a given point near the fireplace. I turned towards the spot, and my gaze rested upon the china dog. With horror I saw that the light came from this ornament. Its body was giving off luminous phosphoric gleams. I might, in my own mind, have accounted for this extraordinary phenomenon by some natural law of chemistry, had it not been for what followed. The head of the brute moved, and its eyes became like living coals. They glared, and gradually changed in colour to blood red. They glared on me until I seemed to wither before their scorching gaze. I was fascinated with horror. I could not move. I could not cry out. I could not even close my eyes to the fearful apparition. In a little while my sufferings were increased by a new torture. Huge spiders with fiery eyes commenced to lower themselves from the ceiling. They lowered themselves until they reached my body. Then they bound me with webs as fine as silk, but as strong as chains of iron. These fearful gyves burned into my flesh. They tortured me with the torture of the damned, and the burning eyes of the fiendish dog seared my very soul. I could endure it no longer. With an effort that was superhuman, I burst the bonds that bound my arms and turned to my wife. I touched her, but she moved not. I called her by name, but she spoke not. I looked at her, and by the weird light that pervaded the apartment, I observed that her face was stony and fixed. The eyes were open, but glazed. She was dead. I know that at that moment I uttered a shriek that reverberated strangely through the dismal building. I struggled with the might of a giant to free myself from the webs of the spiders. I succeeded, and seizing the poker from the fireplace, aimed a terrific blow at the dog. There was a crash. The strange light vanished. But at that moment the door of the room opened, and unknown faces appeared. They were the faces of men and women, and they grinned horribly at me. I sprang at them with my weapon. There was a short struggle, and I believe I was overcome by the demons, who filled every corner of the room. There was a long, long blank. Years must have passed, but that I know not. I remember a mass of things, but nothing definite. 'Tis all a haze, an incoherent dream. I found myself at last in this strange room, the walls of which are padded. I was, as I am now, a prisoner, and when I ask my stern captors why they do not let me go forth into the world again, they answer me with a cruel smile and shake their heads. Why am I deprived of liberty? Alas, I know not. A moth flutters around my lamp. The poor insect is fascinated, as I once was. I stretch forth my hands to save it. Too late. Its wings are scorched. It flutters to the table. It writhes and dies. This tiny thing is typical of my own life in all, save that I live. Such is my story, and I am waiting patiently for the time when I shall be free, and men will no longer say that I am mad. End of Story 10.
Story 11 of Stories Weird and Wonderful. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stories Weird and Wonderful by J. E. Muddock. The Haunted Man. A Strange Case. I am a medical practitioner, resident in a little country town in Cumberland, but my practice for many years has been an uncertain one, and necessarily very scattered. For the country round about is sparsely populated, the population for the most part being farmers and country gentry. The patients amongst this class are not many, for country gentry and farmers, as a rule, are a very healthy lot. Occasionally I have had to make long journeys over the moors and mountains to visit some sick person, for, with the exception of myself and 2 colleagues in the town, there was, until comparatively recently, no other doctor near for many miles. Mine is the oldest practice, as I have been established for 30 years, and in any special or sudden case I am, or rather was, summoned, for my son has succeeded me generally in the country work. I am too old for long journeys now. A country doctor's life is invariably a very active one, and he hasn't much time left him either for recreation or study, that is, book study I mean. But his opportunities for studying the book of life and the human heart are unique. The country parson is supposed to see a good deal of the inner and seamy side of human nature, but the country doctor sees much more than comes under the notice of the parson. Human nature is inherently hypocritical, and it may be doubted if there is anything in connection with this mortal life in which human beings are so hypocritical as in matters of religion. To the parson they affect a piety and sincerity they do not possess. He sees only the smooth and Sunday exterior of his parishioners, but the doctor's calling brings him in contact with people who appear before him in their true colours. It is in the sick chamber that the higher as well as the meaner qualities of the mind make themselves manifest. Sickness tests the devotion and love of friends and relatives, while it brings out all that is mean, covetous, selfish, irritable and cowardly in the patient. The doctor, being admitted behind the scenes, learns a good deal of these things. He sees the lady without the dye on her hair, the padding in her stays, and the rouge on her cheeks, and the man sans that everyday boldness and independence which characterise him when in health. The experiences, indeed, of a country doctor of any standing, or, for the matter of that, of any medical practitioner, are extraordinary, and he could tell stories which, for strangeness, would surpass the wildest imaginings of the fictionist. Fortunately, however, for the world generally, the doctor's secrets are his own. He recognises an unwritten code of honour, which is more severe than the laws of the Medes and Persians, and the secrets of the sick chamber he carries to his grave. Let it not be supposed, therefore, that I am going to prove an exception to the wholesome rule governing a doctor's conduct. But the story I have to tell betrays no such secrets as those I have hinted at. As a matter of fact, it reveals some most remarkable psychological phenomena that I should have been wanting in duty had I failed to make public. I am afraid that my readers will be inclined to accuse me of some prolixity in the foregoing remarks. I will, therefore, plunge at once in medias res. One evening I had just sat down to dine with my family after a somewhat harassing day, when my servant handed me a visiting card on which was the inscription, Mrs. Mabel Augusta Woodall. "Have you shown the lady into the waiting room?" I asked. "Yes, sir, and she says you are not to disturb yourself, as she is not in a hurry." I was glad to hear this, as the craving of nature was keen, and I really wanted my dinner badly, so I proceeded to discuss it leisurely. I could not help speculating, however, as to why I had been honoured with a visit from Mrs. Mabel Augusta Woodall. I had not the pleasure of the lady's acquaintance, but knew her by repute, for in the country one gets to know by gossip a good deal of one's neighbours for many miles around. I was aware that Mrs. Woodall was a young and, gossip said, handsome woman, who had been recently married to Ralph Abercrombie Woodall, a country gentleman, said to be wealthy, but who had long been notorious for his eccentricities. In fact, all his family bore that reputation, and people used to speak of his father as being a bit off his head, while some of the simple yokels had it that old Woodall was on intimate terms with the evil one. Such absurd stories as this, of course, are not uncommon in country districts. The late Mr. Woodall, however, had certainly been peculiar enough to justify almost any belief in the rustic mind. One of his peculiarities was that he used to ride about the countryside frequently all night long. He was never known to enter a church, and he drank heavily, at any rate, so it was alleged, though I never heard of his being seen in a state of intoxication. But the tattle was that he used to lie in bed all day drinking, and rode about at night to get sober. His end certainly was curious enough, and to the country folk was confirmation strong of their belief in the story's current. It appears that he was found dead one morning sitting in his chair. He had always been a robust man, and had never ailed anything. His awfully sudden death, therefore, caused a sensation in the neighbourhood. One of my colleagues, Dr. Budd, who was called in to certify to the cause of death, told me that the old man's face bore a look of fixed, stony horror, such as he had never seen on the face of a dead man in all his life. But this was not all, for on the forehead, near the left temple, was a peculiar, livid blue mark about the size of a 5-shilling piece. As Dr. Budd could assign no cause of death, the coroner was notified, and an inquest and autopsy ordered. The autopsy was carried out by Dr. Budd and a gentleman from a neighbouring town. And now comes the peculiar part of the story. Every organ in the body was found to be perfectly sound, and the livid blue mark on the forehead did not extend below the skin. There was absolutely nothing, so far as medical science could determine, to account for the death, and the verdict was, died by the visitation of God. The son Ralph, who had been abroad for many years, having quarrelled with his father, so it was said, returned home on the old man's death and took possession of the estate. The residence was a fine old country mansion, situated in a lonely but beautiful district, and bearing the extraordinary name of Polestar Hall. The first thing he did was to turn his mother and sister out of the hall, and they took up their residence in a small house on the estate. Then he went to London, was absent about 6 months, and came back with a wife. All these things had reached me as items of common gossip in the community, but they had faded out of my memory, and I had heard nothing of the eccentric owner of Polestar Hall for a long time. Now, as I looked at the visiting card bearing Mrs. Mabel Augusta Woodall's name, I was naturally curious to know what had brought her to me. Having finished my dinner, I went to the consulting room, and Mrs. Woodall rose as I entered. She was a young and good-looking woman, but she had a scared, restless look in her eyes, and her face was pale and worn. I greeted her cordially, and, motioning her to be seated, remarked that I presume she had come to consult me professionally. "Not on my own behalf," she answered, "though I am not very well, but it is worry and want of rest that is the matter with me. I have come about my husband, but entirely without his knowledge, and if he knew that I had come, I am sure he would be very, very angry. For a long time his behaviour has been most extraordinary, and I have come to the conclusion that he is not in his right mind." "Does he complain of anything, madam?" "No, but he says he is haunted." "Ah, that is a bad sign," I remarked. "Now, what do you want me to do?" "I want you to see him, though he must not know that you are a doctor. Whenever I have spoken to him about consulting a doctor, it has seemed to arouse him to a paroxysm of fury. He says he is haunted by 2 demons who won't let him rest, night or day." The lady burst into tears, and seemed much agitated. When she grew calmer, she proceeded. "As I am not only afraid of my husband, but consider that he is dangerous to himself, I want to take steps to ascertain the true state of his mind, with a view to getting him confined in an asylum." Remembering what I had heard about the father, it did not surprise me to learn that the son's eccentricity had developed into madness. But I saw that if I complied with the lady's request, I should be placed in a situation requiring great delicacy and tact. "Does he not complain of physical illness?" I asked. "No, he simply says he is haunted, and, what is more, I am inclined to believe him, for I have seen and heard some most extraordinary things myself." I smiled as I asked her what she had seen, but she said she would rather not tell me, because I was certain to be incredulous, but she begged of me to go back with her there and then. She had driven over in the dog cart, which was waiting at the door. As I was comparatively free that night, having no urgent cases to visit, I consented to return with her, and in a few minutes was ready to start. As we drove along, Mrs. Woodall particularly impressed upon me the necessity for not making my calling known to her husband, who professed to have an unconquerable antipathy to doctors. I did not care about lending myself to deception, but she urged it upon me so strongly that at last I consented, and it was arranged that I was to be represented as a friend from London, who was well acquainted with her family, and for the nonce my name was to be Mr. Peter Jenkins. I had never set my eyes on Mr. Woodall, and he did not know me, so that there was no fear of this innocent little deception being discovered at first. We reached the hall about 8 o'clock, and I was at once shown into the drawing room, while Mrs. Woodall went to inform her husband of my arrival. Half an hour later I was ushered into his presence, and, being unprepared for it, I was perfectly staggered by his extraordinary appearance. He was a tall, gaunt, powerful-looking man, with strongly marked features, with hair of a decided tinge of red, and eyes of a cold grey hue. There was a very remarkable restlessness about these eyes, such as one sees sometimes in certain cases of insanity. They seemed incapable of fixing themselves for many seconds at a time on any object. They were, in fact, the eyes of a hunted animal. His face was of a corpse-like pallor, and altogether his appearance was suggestive of a man who was suffering from some deadly fear. To my professional eye, the signs I saw indicated mental rather than physical illness. He rose and greeted me in a quick, hurried manner as I entered, and appeared to be perfectly rational. "My wife tells me you are from London. Well, you are welcome, very welcome. Sit down. What will you take?" I thanked him and said that at present I did not require anything. Then I gradually drew him into conversation, and said at last, "You must lead a very healthy sort of life in a place like this. The country is charming round about." "Yes, yes, but I never go out. At least, not often. I have an infirmity which makes life somewhat burdensome." "Indeed, but have you not sought the advice of some competent medical man?" His eyes blazed up at this question, and bringing his heavy hand down with a bang on the chair arm, he exclaimed irascibly, "Curse the doctors! No! They are all fraudulent impostors. If you break your neck, or have got anything decidedly the matter with your lungs or heart, or have got a swollen liver, or a carbuncle on your nose, they can tell what's the matter. But go beyond these, and they are all in the dark. And then they commence to experimentalise on you, running the whole gamut of the pharmacopoeia in the hope of stumbling by chance on something that will hit your case. No, sir, doctoring is all confounded quackery, and the higher a doctor stands in his profession, the greater quack he is." This was not very flattering to my amour propre, nor to the great healing art I represented. but I simply laughed and answered, "You are a little severe." "No severer than they deserve. Take my case, now. Supposing I were to call in one of these quacks, what would he do? He would feel my pulse, look at my tongue, and prescribe me a dose of salts and senna." "You are a humorist," I responded, laughing loudly in spite of myself. "If I am so unconsciously, then. If you know anything about doctors, you will know what I say is true. There isn't a doctor in the whole country could tell what is wrong with me." "Is your disease so deep-seated, so novel, that it couldn't be diagnosed?" "Yes, it is." Here he lowered his voice. "The fact is, I am haunted." He bent towards me as he spoke, and strongly emphasised the last sentence. A laugh of derision trembled on my lips, but died away again before it found utterance, for a third voice in a faint treble exclaimed, "Yes, he is haunted." I am free to confess that the effect of this on me was extraordinary. I know that the colour fled from my face, and a cold thrill seemed to shoot through my heart. That voice was in the room, but what part of the room it came from I could not for the life of me have told. The effect was certainly uncanny and startling. Mr. Woodall broke into a coarse, bitter sort of laugh as he exclaimed, "There, did you hear that? That's one of the devils that annoy me. Did you hear it?" he demanded again in a stern tone, as I did not answer immediately. "I did," I said, speaking in profound amazement. He let out a jubilant kind of roar at this, exclaiming, "By heaven, you are a man after my own heart, and I like you. My wife, who is somewhat of a fool, either won't or can't hear these things, and thinks that I am cracked." By this time the effect of the start I had received had passed away, and I began to rate myself as a dull ass, as it occurred to me that Woodall had deceived me by some shallow ventriloquial trickery. "I am glad I have gained your goodwill," I remarked, "and if you are willing to accept advice from me, I should say you ought to go out more. You should mix in society, attend the county meetings, go to the hunt balls, give parties in your own house, and generally enjoy yourself, for the fact is, you are sinking into a condition of misanthropy." His restless eyes sought mine for a second or two, and then he muttered angrily, "How the devil can a haunted man do that? If you could see with my eyes, you would know what I suffer. I'm perfectly well aware that if I were to talk freely about being haunted, people would declare me mad and clap me into a lunatic asylum. The fact is, my wife thinks I am mad and wants to put me away. But I am not going to give her the chance. I have nothing to do with her. I keep her from me as much as possible. But I'm awfully lonely. I want companionship. I want a man who understands me. It is impossible to get women to understand these things. They are such a poor, weak lot of fools." "So they are," I answered, wishing to humour him, and growing deeply interested in his case. He sprang up from his seat, came over to where I sat, and gripped my hands in an iron grasp. "By God, I like you!" he exclaimed. "You are the first sensible man I've met for years." "That must be comforting to you as it flatters me," I answered, returning his grip and seizing his wrist in such a way that, unknown to him, I was enabled to feel his pulse. I found it rapid, thready, and irregular, indicating not only mental excitement, but heart disturbance. "Look here," he said, "would you like to have a walk? I haven't been out for some time, but have confined myself to this room until it has grown hateful to me. But the fact is, don't laugh at me, I'm positively afraid to go out alone now. I wouldn't let my wife accompany me, and I can't ask the servants, for very soon the fools would have it all over the country that I was mad, and I tell you, my friend, I am not mad, but haunted." I was glad of this suggestion of his to go out, and I answered cheerfully, "Yes, let us go by all means." He put on a large cloak and a big slouched hat that gave him somewhat the appearance of an Italian bandit. Then, arming himself with a massive stick that stood in the corner near his chair, he said, "Come." We went down the broad and noble flight of stairs that rose from the centre of an imposing hall. His arm was linked in mine. Mrs. Woodall had evidently heard us coming, and opened the door of a room in the hall. She looked surprised, of course, but a glance from me warned her, and she said nothing. As we descended the stone steps of the main entrance, Woodall said with a growl, "Do you see how that woman watches me? I can't stir for her." Then he took off his hat and exclaimed, "Ah, how refreshing that breeze is!" An avenue of magnificent beech trees ran straight for 100 yards or so from the entrance to the house to the large iron gates and porter's lodge. The night was dark, though starlight, and a strong breeze played amongst the trees, now rising to a shriek, now dying away in mournful cadence. It was a solemn sort of night, and one calculated to impress the most unimpressionable. My strange companion and I walked arm in arm down the avenue for some distance without speaking. He seemed to be drinking in great gulps of the pure, fresh air as it came from the mountain and moorland, and I thought it better not to talk to him for a little time. But suddenly I stopped, for I heard footsteps close behind us. They did not seem to be sounds made by the feet of either man or woman, but the soft footfalls of a child who walked with monotonous regularity. I peered into the darkness, but could see nothing or nobody. "What is it?" Woodall asked. "I thought I heard somebody following us," I said. He broke into his strange laugh again as he exclaimed, "Tut, man, that is one of my familiars. Have I not told you I am haunted? Wherever I go, those footsteps follow me." I will make no attempt to describe my feelings as he said this. I really began to believe I was being made a fool of by my own senses. He might have deceived me with the voice in the room, but he could not produce these pattering footsteps. We moved on. Then I heard the footsteps again. We stopped. They stopped. We went on, and they went on, always with a soft pit-pat, 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 like the measured ticking of a great old-fashioned 8-day clock. What was the mystery? I could not repress a shudder, and the trees seemed to shudder in concert as the wind blew through them. If any of my readers should be disposed to think me weak, let him try and imagine the situation. A ghostly sort of night. Overhead, the stars watching in solemn splendour. Rows of tall trees with great masses of foliage through which the wind wailed and sighed. All around dark, with a blackness that was impenetrable. And following me, some invisible being or thing that made audible footfalls. It was unearthly. It was weird, thrilling. I walked from side to side of the avenue. I went forward and backward, but discovered nothing that would account for the sounds which stopped when Woodall stopped, and came again when he went on. It was only when he moved that I heard them. To say that I was puzzled would hardly express my state of mind, and I am honest enough to say that I found the scepticism of which I had so long boasted giving place to a feeling of superstition. Certainly here was something which I could not account for, reason how I would. Forward and backward we walked, and forward and backward those ghostly footsteps followed us. I suggested to Woodall we should go out on the high road. It was not so dark there as in the avenue where the great trees wrapped everything in shadow. The road was hard and whitish, and it would have been quite easy to have seen another person had he been there several yards away. But no living thing was in sight, and yet those awful footsteps followed close behind us, with their maddening pit-pat, pit-pat. I could no longer wonder at Woodall's state of mind, for I felt that if I listened to those sounds long I should go mad myself, for their persistency and monotony were terrible. "Tell me," I whispered to my companion, "have you been subjected to this sort of thing long?" "For about 2 years." "Have you any theory about it?" "No. I believe, though, my father was haunted in the same way. The torture is unbearable," he added with a shudder. "And the worst is, I get no sympathy. My wife shuns me and thinks I am mad." We walked up and down until I felt that my nerves were becoming unstrung. Absolutely I could endure no longer the sound of those mysterious footfalls, and I suggested that we should go in. He readily complied, and we returned to the house. A servant opened the door, but we saw no one else, and went straight upstairs to Mr. Woodall's room, where, divesting himself of his coat and hat, he threw himself wearily on the sofa, saying to me, "I suppose you stay here all night. My wife didn't tell me of your coming. But there, I'm not surprised. She tells me nothing. There is not an atom of sympathy between us." He had driven me into a corner, as it were, by his direct question, and, without a barefaced untruth, I did not see how I was to get out of it. But, fortunately, he was so absorbed by his own mournful reflections that he did not give me time to answer, but continued, "If I could only sleep long and soundly it would be a tremendous relief. But I can't. They won't let me. All night long I hear voices and footsteps. Sometimes the voices are intelligible, at others not, and if I happen to fall asleep, a hand roughly shakes and awakens me." "Well now," I answered, I have sometimes been troubled with sleeplessness myself, but I have got a remedy which I always have handy. Have you? He asked eagerly. Yes. Shall I give you a little of it? Yes. I should like to try it, he answered somewhat hesitatingly. Turning my back to him and going to the sideboard, I drew out my pocket medicine case, which I always carried with me, and which is indispensable to a country practitioner. I took therefrom a sleeping draught, and, pouring it into a wine glass, filled it with water and handed it to him, saying, "Take this as soon as you get into bed. I am sure it will make you sleep. Now, good night. We shall meet again to-morrow." He shook my hand and we parted. Mrs. Woodall met me at the bottom of the stairs and took me into her sitting room. I could not bring myself to tell her what I had heard with my own ears, but I said that I considered her husband was in a very bad way and wanted watching and companionship. For the present, however, I could express no definite opinion as to his mental condition. It would be necessary for me to see him again 3 or 4 times, and promising to return the following day, I took my departure. As I drove home, I felt in a perfect state of mystification. The case was one of the most extraordinary I had ever known, and for the first time in my life I that night began to think there were things which could not be accounted for by any known human or natural laws. The next day I again visited my patient, for so I had a right to regard him. He informed me that he had slept for several hours, the most enjoyable sleep he had had for a long time. He certainly looked refreshed, and I began to feel hopeful that by a course of treatment and weaning him from himself, he might be restored to his normal condition again. I therefore ventured, very cautiously, to suggest that he should have a doctor to attend to him, but he flew into a violent temper. He poured out a volley of abuse on the heads of doctors generally, and said that a doctor would declare him mad at once if he told him that he was haunted, and he would be put into a lunatic asylum. I assured him that I knew a doctor who would not do this, but he vowed that no medical man should come near him. As I saw that it was hopeless to try and convince him then, and that to discuss the subject further would dangerously excite him, I said no more. In order not to arouse his suspicions, I told him I was going to stay in the village for some days, as I knew some people there, but that I would come and see him every day. He was pleased at this, and I went away. I need not say I was much puzzled about this strange case. I was tempted to consult with some of my professional brethren, but I felt sure that if I did, and told them of my own experience, they would say that he was mad, and I was as mad as he. I therefore decided not to mention it, but felt it was my duty to speak very plainly to Mrs. Woodall. And when I told her what I had heard, she burst into weeping and said, "I, too, have frequently heard voices and footsteps when I have been with him, but I shrank from telling you this lest you should think that I, too, ought to be confined in an asylum, nor have I ever let him know that I heard them." I was more than ever astounded, and could no longer doubt that what I had heard was an actual reality and not a delusion, for here was confirmation in what Mrs. Woodall told me. The reader will see at once how extremely difficult it would have been to have convinced anyone else if the person had not had oral proof as I had had. My anxiety about Woodall was naturally very great, and, while I hesitated to take any of my colleagues into confidence, I nevertheless felt that it was a duty, from many points of view, to do so. But I resolved at any rate to wait for 2 or 3 weeks and deal with my patient as best I could in the meantime. I was relieved of the necessity, however, of doing so by a terrible and unexpected denouement. One morning, a fortnight after my first visit, a messenger came post-haste from Polestar Hall, asking me to go without a moment's delay. I went on horseback as fast as my beast would carry me. Mrs. Woodall met me in the hall. She was weeping bitterly. "Oh, doctor," she moaned, "I fear he is dead." I was shocked at this news and hurried to his room. He was sitting in his chair, his head bent forward on his breast. On his face a look of stony horror. But what was more startling, on his temple was a blue, livid mark, about the size of a 5-shilling piece. I was dumb in the presence of this awful mystery, which I was utterly powerless to explain. Having been attending him, I was enabled to avoid an inquest, and certified his death as due to apoplexy. He had died in the same way as his father, and in that case the verdict had been "died by the visitation of God," which is capable of various interpretations. For many, many years I have kept the knowledge of this truly remarkable case to myself, but I have come recently to believe that it was no more than my duty to put it on record, that it may be classed among those phenomena which utterly elude the grasp of our human comprehension, but which, nevertheless, manifest themselves occasionally to our utter amazement. After all, we are but little beings, and girt round by the very narrow limits of the finite world of the seen, while the world of the unseen, of which we only occasionally catch very shadowy glimpses, is infinite. End of Story 11.
Story 12 of Stories Weird and Wonderful. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rafe Ball. Stories Weird and Wonderful by J. E. Muddock. Ruth, a story of animal magnetism. Note: should the reader recognise the little church herein described, he will know that for a long time one of the objects of interest in the neighbourhood was an old grey-headed man who, during the summer, was to be seen sitting every evening within the iron railings enclosing a grave in the churchyard. He died recently, and lies buried close to the grave that had so much attraction for him. His story, as here told, is, in substance, strictly true. The wreck spoken of actually occurred, and the poor boy sleeps between 2 trees, as described in the story. If I choose to sit here night after night, it surely injures no man. If it has been my fancy to rail her grave round, and to sit within those railings, it ought not to subject me to ridicule. If it is my whim to come here, that I may enjoy the peace of this city of the dead, it is an injustice that people should speak of me as one a little deranged but harmless. Isn't it Bulwer Lytton who says, "We know the epochs of the world but ill, if we examine not their romance. There is as much truth in the poetry of life as in its prose. What is this poetry of life, may I ask? Certainly not the fierce struggle that men enter into with one another in their greed for gain. But when the requirements of the body have been supplied, the soul asserts itself, and in its yearning for knowledge we become sensible of a spiritual element within us. This element gives us a foretaste of a higher life, and he who is enabled to break away from the commonplaceness and the vulgarity of a grovelling existence hears poetry in the wind and the trees and the surging sea, and he sees it in the stars and the flowers and 1,000 other things that most men are blind to. If, in our search for knowledge, we only accept as truth that which we are capable of comprehending, then we reduce ourselves to the level of brutes. If, on the other hand, we admit that in our narrow sphere of observation we are as mariners on a raft in the centre of an ocean, seeing nothing of the glories of those lands that lie below the horizon, then we confess ourselves men with the attributes of gods. Although we are chained to this world by bondage of the flesh, we may still learn much from inspiration. Or will you tolerate my saying by psychical intuition? By that I mean that, if we affect not to disdain the poetry of life, we may, by aid of the mystic light of romance, catch glimpses of the spiritual existence. By romance, let it be understood that I mean that which in our smallness of mind we reject as untrue because our comprehension fails to grasp it. My story, I know, is a strange one, but it is entitled to credence, albeit it is mystical. If I sit here in this solemn place, it is for the sake of the companionship of her whose body is beneath my feet, but whose spirit holds communion with me. I prefer the solemn company of the dead to the wearying, idle chatter of the living. I love this solitude. It suits me well after a long life of feverish restlessness. For me the spot is hallowed and haunted. Many ages ago nature hereabouts rent her bosom by some convulsive sob. The natives call these dells chines. 'Tis a pretty name. Now, as you see, the same awful power that rent the rocks and earth has hidden the traces of its fury, and 1,000 beauties clothe the rift. Sheltered from the nipping winds, flowers bloom perennially, and the graceful ferns grow in luxurious profusion. Here and there the disrupted rocks, moss-covered and green with the growth of countless ages, give an air of savage grandeur to the dell, while below, at a fearful depth, the awful sea, green and flaky in its wrath, roars on the hard white sand and beats itself against the black iron cliffs. The silence of this spot of enchantment is unbroken, save for that roar of the sea and the moan of the wind. But the sea does not always roar, nor the wind moan. There is a strange peace then, and in yonder wood a sad nightingale at times sings sweetly. Sometime in the far-off past a church was built. Its builders must have planted it in this solitude in order that, when the sea was angry, they might, in its very presence, lift up their voices to the God at whose command even the waves sink to sleep. The church is a tiny, square-towered, low-roofed place, the stonework now completely hidden by the enfolding ivy. Around this sacred shrine, shut in by a low, moss-covered wall, they who once worshipped at its altar now take their rest. Over them wave the tall trees, and below them moans the sea. It is truly a city of the dead, beautiful but solemn, and withal filled with saddened memories. For see those 2 aged trees whose branches interlace. Between their 2 massive trunks is a white slab placed over the remains of a youth who was the sole support of a widowed mother. All England shuddered as it read the pathetic story of his death. It was his first voyage, and he was returning from some far distant port, when one winter's night, when he was in sight of home, an angry wind drove his ship onto those rocks below, and the cruel waves, sparing older lives, flung the mangled body of that poor child on the white shore. They buried him there between those trees, and he sleeps quietly enough now within sound of the sea that slew him. Such is the spot of beauty situated within a few hours' ride of the great metropolis. It is a fitting resting place for her whose story I have to tell. She loved the sea, loved it in all its moods, and when it was most angry, she used to say it was most sublime. Our meeting was commonplace enough, but the results of that meeting were truly incomprehensible. Her name was Ruth. She and I had been invited to spend the evening at the house of a mutual friend. She was one of a number of young ladies, a merry party, full of life, joy and happiness, she perhaps the merriest of the lot. Pressing engagements prevented my joining them until the evening had far advanced. The company were nearly all strangers to me, and as I entered the room I received a general introduction. My eyes quickly wandered from face to face until they rested on Ruth's. What was the power that fixed them there, that caused me to stare rudely until she blushed scarlet and turned her head away? If death, in the shape we represent him, a ghastly skeleton brandishing his spear, had entered the room and summoned her to immediately surrender up her soul, her face could not have grown more livid than it did immediately after she had averted her head. The red went and the white came as suddenly as it would have done if a powerful electric shock had been sent through the heart. And from the instant I gazed upon her, her fate was as surely sealed as if she had been stricken with a plague. That woman was to die through me. Yet in what way was I responsible for her death? We had come together by accident, I possessing some weird power of fascination, she filled with a fatal susceptibility. Our eyes met, and that instant the chain was riveted. Was she the victim of animal magnetism? We know that such a power exists. To deny it would be a matter not of faith, but obstinate ignorance. Ruth's personal appearance was interesting. She was well formed, and her face, by no means handsome, was nevertheless striking, and arrested one's attention in an unusual way. A pretty face has a natural attractiveness, but the attractiveness of Ruth's face was not that of prettiness. To say exactly what it was would be difficult from any casual inquiry. So far as her features were concerned, they were exceedingly pleasing. She had a well-shaped mouth, though it lacked firmness. Her nose was straight, her forehead, for a woman, large. Her complexion was a soft olive, delicately blended with red. Her hair, extraordinarily profuse, was, in colour, a rich, dark, glossy brown, in texture fine and silky, with a natural wave. It was negligently but gracefully gathered in folds, its only ornament a single dark red rose. I have not yet spoken of her eyes. It is by the eyes we read the soul. Ruth's were liquid, dreamy, brown in colour, and full of a nervous light that flashed and quivered as their owner was moved by joy or fear. They were the true poet's eyes, sympathetic, tender, mournful. Such was Ruth, the representative of a class of women who seem out of place in this cold world of scepticism and cynicism, and yet they are the women who make heroes of men by setting the example of patience, by boldly meeting the troubles of life, by defiantly scorning all that is false, bravely loving all that is true, and dying fearlessly when their time comes. If if I have dwelt upon the physical characteristics of Ruth, it is in order that subsequent events may be better understood. It had been my lot to gain some little fame as a public reader. My host was aware of this, and politely requested me to entertain the company by the recital of one or other of my favourite pieces. The request was generally endorsed, and so I readily assented. The audience ranged themselves round the room, Ruth setting herself on an ottoman at the feet of a companion. A music stand was utilised for a reading desk, and I took up my position at the end of the room, facing my audience. In the centre of the group were Ruth and her companion, who were immediately opposite me. I had asked for a volume of Byron's poems, intending to read The Dream, but by a mischance somebody had handed me a volume of Longfellow instead. I did not notice this until I opened the book and my eye rested on Evangeline. It is a favourite poem of mine. I had made a study of it. To my mind, there was something verging on the sublime in that wonderful devotion of the woman as she wandered over the earth in search of her lost love. It is true that in the beautiful story, human nature is depicted in the highest moral aspect. But does the man live who dares to deny that such devotion is altogether chimerical? Much as I loved this poem, I did not care about reading it publicly. It wrought so much upon my own feelings that I invariably found my voice faltering and my eyes growing misty. This may be a great confession of weakness, but better to own the existence of a green spot in one's nature than boast an utter indifference to the softening influences of the poetically expressed ideas of other men. True poetry is the soul's language, and as such should thrill the soul. I mentioned the mistake about the book, and said that I had a personal reason for not wishing to read Evangeline. But my objection was at once overruled, and so, without further preliminary, I commenced. This is the forest primeval. I know not how it was, but as I struck the keynote, an indefinable sense of sorrow stole over me, and as my eyes wandered to Ruth's, I involuntarily likened her to Longfellow's ideal woman. As I proceeded, I knew that I grew eloquent, as who would not with such a theme so loftily expressed? I fancied that a kind of mist filled the room that hid all else from me but the figure of Ruth. It seemed to me, indeed, that I was gazing upon the living, breathing Evangeline as she sat by some nameless grave, and thought that perhaps in its bosom he was already at rest, and she longed to slumber beside him. I became strangely affected. I read with passionate eloquence. The wonderful feeling that stirred me affected my listeners, and I heard the sobbing of women, but saw naught save Ruth. A breath from the region of spirits seemed to float in the air of night. As the last line of the beautiful poem fell from my lips, the spell was broken. I was exhausted and nervous. I closed the book and sank upon a couch that was near. Then all eyes were directed to Ruth, who slowly rose from her seat. Her face was the hue of marble, her eyes were fixed on me. She crossed the room and came to where I sat. I saw at once that she was in a magnetic sleep, and I motioned to the wondering onlookers not to disturb her. "Would you like to see my hair?" she said in a strange, dreamlike voice as she sat down beside me. "It's beautiful hair. See how thick and luxuriant it is." As she spoke, she slowly drew out the pins that confined her tresses and shook the beautiful, brown, wavy hair in a rippling mass over her shoulders, passing her white fingers through the heavy folds and repeating the words, "Is it not beautiful?" In a few minutes she was silent. The fingers ceased their movements. Her head fell back, her lips quivered, and she burst into a fit of hysterical sobbing. They carried her up to bed, and, as I felt ill and nervous, I excused myself and went home. All night long I was strangely restless. I was at a loss to account for the influence I had exerted over the girl. Something mysterious had happened, I knew that, for do we not live in an atmosphere of mystery? Did not the great Plato say that the trembling power of the magnet was a spirit power? Pythagoras believed that the human soul could predict the future and unveil the mysteries. Heraclitus taught the doctrine that all living things had a soul and an evil spirit, while the learned Thales was convinced that in all men was a spirit that had the power of revealing secrets of the unknown world to mortal eyes, but that this power could be seldom exercised, owing to man's obdurate nature. On the following day I called to make inquiries about Ruth. I was informed that she had been taken home in a very prostrate condition. Some weeks passed, and she had apparently quite recovered. One evening I was returning to my home. It was winter time, and the night was very dark. I had to traverse a long country road that was lampless and lonely. I had not proceeded far before I became conscious that somebody or something was following me. If I went on, it followed. If I stopped, it stopped. I got uneasy. Not that I feared anything mortal, but this unknown something made me nervous. I determined at length to solve the mystery, if mystery it was. I turned back, and, after walking about a dozen yards, I stood face to face with a figure, a female figure. It was Ruth. "Why, Ruth, what are you doing here?" I exclaimed in wonderment. "Seeking you," she answered in low tones. I realized immediately that she was in a magnetic trance. I knew that to awaken her suddenly would be to jeopardize her life. I was troubled and scarcely knew how to act. She was thinly clad. The air was filled with snow, and a piercing wind was blowing. I drew her arm through mine and turned back again towards the town. Her hands were icy cold, and she shivered as if suffering from ague. "You're not well," I whispered, as I led her gently along. "Quite well," she answered, "and happy with you." "You must return to your home," I said. "Yes, if you desire it." "I do desire it." "Then your wish is law." "Why?" "Because I love you." There was no alteration in her tone as she said this. She was still asleep. In a little while I was enabled to procure a cab. She got inside at my bidding, and without any assistance from me. She was perfectly passive and subdued to my will. As the vehicle neared her home I awoke her. She was greatly confused at first, and wept bitterly. I managed, however, to soothe her, when she confessed that she had followed me to my place of business, drawn by some strange power that was irresistible. She had watched me leave my office, and then her mind had got confused. Before I left her she had become quite calm, and was apparently well. But with her recovery I had become depressed, and before I reached my house I was suffering from intense cerebral excitement which confined me to the house for several days. When I recovered I felt it to be no more than my duty to acquaint Ruth's friends with the case, and request them to exercise some restraint over her movements. This was done, and for weeks I heard nothing more of her, and began to think my influence had ceased. But my hopes were quickly blighted by a sudden message from her brother, requesting me to hasten to his sister, who was dangerously ill and insisted on seeing me. On arrival, I learned that she had been suffering from extraordinary excitement for days, and had called loudly for me. They had restrained her from going out, and she had gradually grown worse, and when I arrived, she was utterly prostrated. I had been sent for by the advice of her physician. I met him at the house. He told me that I, and I alone, could save her life. "How?" I asked in astonishment. "By making her your wife." As there was no obstacle in the way of such an alliance taking place, I determined to give the matter serious consideration, and, at the proper time, discuss the question with Ruth herself. She grew much calmer during my stay, and was able to converse rationally. She ingenuously told me that in my presence she felt supremely happy. I stayed with her for some hours, but I did not think it was a fitting opportunity to speak of such a thing as marriage. When I reached home that night, I examined my feelings for Ruth, and was astonished to find how, unconsciously, as it were, she had grown precious to me. I decided, however, to let matters remain as they were for a week, and at the end of that time seek an interview and ask her to engage herself to me with a view to marriage. But that delay was fatal. 3 days afterwards I was very restless. An indescribable nervousness seized me, and towards evening I grew very ill. For hours I tossed upon the bed in a state of feverish restlessness, but at length slept. I did not sleep long. I awoke suddenly, for a hand was laid upon my head. I looked up. At the bedside was Ruth, not in the flesh, but the spirit. On her face was an expression of ineffable sorrow. "I have just died," she murmured. "Died for your sake." Then, with a deep sigh, she faded away. I sprang out of bed and procured a light, and noted by the clock on the mantelpiece that it was exactly 4 o'clock. Suddenly I seemed to be raised from my feet and carried by some strange agency through space. I sped on with terrible velocity past fragments of shattered worlds, now in the light of gleaming stars, anon through darkness that was awful. Presently strange forms were moving around me. They were dark, shapeless masses. But in a little while they seemed to be surrounded with nebulous light that revealed them as human figures. I was in the world of spirits, and she, Ruth, was with me. Dreamlike and indistinct and strange were all things. "Even death cannot separate us," she said, as she placed her hand in mine and led me to the bank of a river. "This is the river of death," she murmured. Again I was caught up by the same mysterious agency and carried with lightning velocity through space, and as I went I thought all the hair was blown from my head. I reached the earth again and fell into a sound and refreshing sleep. When I awoke the sun was shining, though with a subdued light, into my room. I noticed with some surprise that a blue blind hung at my window. It was not so when I went to sleep. Flowers in vases stood upon the table. They were not there before. Where had they come from? Had she brought them? Were questions I asked myself. Then I became aware that my head was enveloped in some covering. I put my hand up and found that I was wearing a cap. An oilskin cap. I removed it. My head was bare. Not a vestige of hair remained. Before I could recover from my surprise, a woman entered. A strange woman, She crossed the room to replenish the flower vases with water. I felt that I was the victim of a cruel hoax. I attempted to spring from the bed, but was as helpless as a child. "What is the meaning of this outrage?" I cried. The woman turned quickly round. "Oh, sir, I am so glad you are better," she said. "Better?" I repeated. "Yes, sir. You have been very ill, but thank God the crisis has passed. You will soon recover now, and be able to go away for a change of air." "How long have I been here?" I asked sadly, as the truth commenced to dawn upon me. "More than a month now, sir." What was the mystery, then? Had I really been to the spirit world? Had Ruth really come to me? Yes, I knew she had. I gradually grew stronger. I was enabled to go out. I learned then that on the date and at the hour I had noted, poor Ruth had died. The night I left her, she was considerably better, but a day or two afterwards grew worse, said that I was cruel in forsaking her, and in a paroxysm of cerebral excitement, and with my name on her lips, she had passed away. In accordance with an oft and earnestly expressed wish of hers, her friends buried her in this sweet little churchyard, she having been born in the adjoining village. I felt that in some way I was morally guilty of her death. Had I confessed my love for her on the last night I had seen her, her life might have been spared. But, as she said it should be, death has not parted us. In a spirit form she is ever with me. I felt that I could not bear to be far from her resting place, and so I came here, and as I sit in the quiet of the summer twilight, I hold sweet communion with her spirit, and we talk of things I dare not repeat, lest men should scoff. Sometimes, when I wend my way, stool in hand, down the dell, I meet the villagers returning from their labours. They shake their heads and whisper one with another, and, when they think I cannot hear, say, "Ah, the poor fellow, he will never be better." I know not what they mean, but this I do know: the story I have told you is true. End of Ruth. Recording by Rafe Ball.